What makes the achievement of emotional sobriety so difficult is the habits we have, the patterns we have in our behavior, the habitual ways that we've come to think about things. We have to really become aware of those things in order to challenge them, because the consciousness that has created a lot of the problems in our life cannot solve it, cannot change things. So what happens is the first step is waking up.
I'd like to start with a bit of self-disclosure to illustrate the concept we've talked about a lot in this workshop, the concept of self-acceptance. For about a year now, I've had a problem with migraines in my life. Have a family history of them in my mom's side, but I needed to reach the ripe old age of 72 a year ago before I started experiencing the joy of migraine headaches. And so, of course, it happened that yesterday evening I got one and kept me up all night last night. And through today, it's continued. Thankfully, it's eased off some, which is what allows me to be here. I'm bringing it up because if you notice that I seem a little more pale than usual, or tired, or distracted, or downright cranky, you're not imagining things, all right? But one thing that adverse events like this does is it gives me a chance to try to practice self-acceptance, right? Because I notice myself during the night last night, during the day-to-day, starting to get angry, starting to get self-pitying, starting to get frustrated, because I am on preventative medication for these things, but it's just not working that well. But all along the way, this emotional sobriety meeting and workshop keeps coming back to me, right? The things that we are all learning here together keep coming back to me. Practice not buying into my own story, my own narrative too much. Practice recentering myself, practice trying to have acceptance toward the experience that I am having. So that allows me to also be grateful to each of you for this opportunity to speak here tonight. And it comes with the added bonus of giving me something else to focus on besides how my forehead feels. So it turns out that the pain we experience in life, whether it be physical or emotional pain, has a lot to do with where our attention is focused. And I won't say more about that tonight, but at some point maybe I will. I'll say that again. The pain we experience in life, the frequency of pain as well as the intensity of pain, has a great deal to do with where our attention is focused. A famous psychotherapist and hypnotherapist named Milton Erickson understood that principle very well, doing pain management work with his patients. So as Allen said, tonight we're talking about step 7, humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings, and how it is that working step 7, working the 12 steps, also is working on our self-esteem, is enhancing and building our sense of self-respect, our sense of self-confidence, our sense of self-worth. We've talked at length in these meetings about the work of self-esteem theorist and psychologist Nathaniel Branden. We're using his book, The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, as our primary reference. Those 6 pillars, again, are living more consciously, paying better attention is another way to say that, living with more self-acceptance, self-responsibility, self-assertiveness, more purposefulness in our life, and greater integrity. And then he also added at the very end of the book what we've been calling a 7th pillar, the pillar of willingness. So what does that mean? Well, you heard Herb give a great explanation and introduction to step 7 last week. Humbly ask him to remove our shortcomings. To me, it means humbly ask our higher power, as we understand him or her, to remove our character defaults, what we're also calling our unhealthy coping patterns. It also means to me a willingness to place surrendering to reality ahead of my demands and my preferences, to make a sincere effort to align my thoughts, feelings, and actions with what is true, including migraine headaches, whether I want to do that and feel like doing that or not. And when I don't choose to do that, to try to create that alignment between my perceptions and thoughts and reality, to be willing to look at that and what the consequences of that are for me. Again, none of this, believe me, is about perfectionism. Okay, it's not about doing it perfectly. Far, far from that. But it's about having the intention and the willingness to make that effort. I have the experience very often that what I'm in the mood to do and what I feel like doing does not align with what reality is strongly suggesting or recommending I actually do. Another way to say that is often what I want to do is not synonymous with what I need to do. And how I handle those moments determines a lot about my level of happiness and my level of self-esteem. In my own life, I've noticed that my progress toward greater self-esteem and emotional sobriety is helped if I, number one, choose to use my awareness to pay attention to and be curious about my own functioning, including the ways that I cope with emotional pain or physical pain, depression, anxiety, and other feelings I often seek to avoid. Number two, my self-esteem tends to go up if I surrender little by little, day by day, my typical patterns of coping, whether it be withdrawal and passivity, hostility and aggression, strong emotional dependency, which we talk a great deal about here, placating and controlling others, excessive self-centeredness and self-focus, and so on. And number three, in small steps, to experiment with new ways of acting, new ways of behaving, thinking, and feeling, often referred to as a willingness to take contrary action. For example, if my characteristic way of responding to stress or anxiety is to become aggressively self-centered, I can practice becoming more aware of my aggressive thoughts, words, and behaviors. I can practice taking ownership and responsibility of my aggressive responses by learning to describe them and taking ownership of them as my feelings and impulses, rather than impulsively acting them out or speaking them out. I can find other ways to perceive people in situations that reduce my emotional dependency on them. And I can become aware of unhelpful attitudes of blaming that I might be bringing into my relationships with others or toward myself. Finally, I can learn to exercise regularly or meditate or pray or use any number of other skills that may help me manage my aggressiveness more effectively. So in writing about step 7 in the 12 steps and 12 traditions of AA, Bill Wilson writes much about the importance of humility. And you've heard us speak often about the critical role that humility plays in the growth of emotional sobriety and what we call humility-based self-esteem. But Nathaniel Branden wrote very little, explicitly at least, about the importance of humility. How do we reconcile this? Is humility important to the growth of a genuine sense of self-worth? and authentic self-esteem, or isn't it? Well, I want to argue that Brandon actually writes a great deal about the importance of humility. He just doesn't call it that. He just doesn't use that word. He doesn't frame it that way. You've heard me talk a lot, if you've been to prior meetings, about what he calls pseudo self-esteem, efforts we make to fill in the holes inside of us, the holes in our feelings of how lovable we are, how confident we are, how worthy of happiness we are. He calls those efforts pseudo self-esteem. And what do I mean? Well, for instance, through the acquisition of a lot of money or possessions or economic power, through sexual conquests, through denial and self-deception, through efforts to change and control others, through all manner of excessively self-centered and self-aggrandizing behaviors and attitudes. With all of those, he's writing to me about the importance of humility. He identifies all of those patterns in very much the same way that Bill does in the 12 and 12, as patterns that don't grow us in emotional sobriety or grow us in terms of self-esteem. Rather, he identifies them as defects, as you'll see in a quote in a few minutes. It's through facing reality as best we can, perceiving it accurately as accurately as we're able, and surrendering to reality that we grow, that we make progress. He's writing about humility when he writes about living more consciously. Quote, living consciously implies respect for the facts of reality. This means the facts of the inner world, including our own needs and wants and emotions, as well as facts of the outer world. Living consciously is living responsibly toward reality. In my own words, it's living life on life's terms. It's living in a way that personifies humility. I didn't originate those words. I mean my own words as opposed to Brandon's, okay? But functioning with humility rather than arrogance, to recognize that reality is reality, that truth is truth as best we can perceive it. He goes on to say that wishes or fears or denial do not alter external facts. Quote, when we live consciously, we do not confuse the subjective or inner reality world with the objective world. We do not imagine that our feelings are an infallible guide to truth. And I want to say that again. We do not imagine that our feelings are an infallible guide to truth. Let me give an example that he gives in the 6 pillars of self-esteem. If I'm told by my physician that I need a life-saving surgical procedure, I may have a lot of fear about the possibility of that procedure. My fear does not mean that I don't need to have that surgery. My fear does not mean that I'm going to survive if I choose not to have that surgery. Now, that example is pretty straightforward, I think, but one that's much more common, hopefully, than life-saving surgery is for us. What if my feeling in a relationship where I've just met somebody I'm excited about is excitement and infatuation and great emotional intensity? And that feeling says to me that he or she has to be right for me, has to be right for me. I love him or her so much, right? Well, that's an example that most of us, I think, can probably relate to. But if we've had enough life experience, often we find that our feelings were not necessarily telling us the whole story with regard to ourselves or toward another person. Our emotional needs and desires have remarkable ability to distort our perceptions of reality. I'll read that again. Our emotional needs and desires have remarkable ability to distort our perception of reality. But it's not as simple as that. At times, and in some ways, our feelings can be better guides to the truth what we might call intuition or an emotional level of awareness, can sometimes be more accurate guides to truth than our conscious reasoning is, especially when our reasoning, quote unquote, is really being used to just rationalize or make excuses for ourselves or for others. So it's not simple, right? Life is complicated. Otherwise, we'd already all have it figured out. So what specifically does Bill say about humility in step 7? I think he has some outstanding observation and some great ways of wording some of those observations. Quote, "For just so long as we are convinced that we could live exclusively by our own individual strength and intelligence, for just that long has a working faith in a higher power been impossible." Here he's pointing out the limitations of a viewpoint that says, rather than, quote, all for one and one for all, our viewpoint is all for me and me for me too. Okay. He's warning. These are quotes from the 12 and 12, the 12 steps and 12 traditions of AA. He's warning us against a simplistic self-reliance that ignores the power of connections to others and the interplay needed for each of us, for all of us, to thrive in our lives. The balance you hear us talk about between concern for self and concern for others. We can easily become so self-focused that we lose focus on far greater powers than we each wield as individuals. The power of nature, of God as we understand him, of our genetic inheritance, of our inbuilt drive for wholeness and relationship that you've heard Allen particularly talk about a lot, of our independence that we share with the world and with other people. I hope I said interdependence, not independence there. I meant to say interdependence. Another quote, a place in the 12 and 12, chapter 7, he says, "So it is that we first see humility as a necessity," right? As a necessity. Living life in a way that has destroyed one's life has generated a feeling of necessity, of extreme humiliation, right? That drives us to humility. But this is the barest beginning. To gain a vision of humility as the avenue to true freedom of the human spirit, to be willing to work for humility as something to be desired for itself, takes most of us a long, long time. A whole lifetime geared towards self-centeredness cannot be set in reverse all at once. And Bill makes that point in, steps 4, 5, 6, and 7 very well. We don't have all of our character defects removed from us instantaneously. As human beings, in recovery, out of recovery, just as human beings, it's a lifelong process. Here he's pointing out the larger gifts that humility can give us, where it's no longer driven just by a sense of humiliation, where it becomes a goal, a worthwhile practice in itself. As the theologian and poet Thomas Merton says, pride, which we often contrast with humility, right? I would say unhealthy pride or harmful pride, but pride makes us artificial and humility makes us real. Arrogance and grandiosity are barriers to authenticity, to vulnerability, to self-contact, to genuine connection with others. A few more particularly colorful from my point of view, writings from Bill W. on humility. Where humility had formerly stood for a forced feeding on humble pie, I love that expression, it now begins to mean the nourishing ingredient which can give us serenity. So to me, he's saying moving from humility as a direct derivative of humiliation to humility as a positive virtue to be attained and practiced, as a goal to be sought. We saw that we needn't always be bludgeoned and beaten into humility. It can come quite as much from our voluntary reaching for it as it could from our unremitting suffering. Same idea, right? But I love the notion of metaphor of being bludgeoned and beaten into submission. So how does Brandon, from my point of view, without using the word humility, draw attention to humility? Well, I already spoke to that with those quotes with regard to the first pillar of living consciously. He has an affirmation or mantra from his book, How to Raise Your Self-Esteem, from the chapter of self-acceptance that I want to share with all of you, because I love the way it integrates, it brings together to me an acknowledgement of imperfection, of defects, and an acknowledgement of worth and value. It's a very simple affirmation. I invite you to silently say it to yourselves. So start with taking a deep, slow breath, if you would. Notice the feeling of that breath in your chest or your belly. And then silently repeat this affirmation to yourself. Whatever my defects and imperfections, I accept myself unreservedly and completely. Again, this is not about perfectionism. I hope. No, I know it's not for Nathaniel or for us. I want to repeat that. Whatever my defects and imperfections, I accept myself unreservedly and completely. And I ask us each to reflect for a moment on the difference it might make in our lives, in how I feel about myself and how I treat myself, how I feel toward other people, even. The difference it would make in my behavior in the world and in my self-concept, how I see myself and my self-esteem, how I feel toward myself. If I actually believed this, or if I repeated this a number of times daily, combined with slowing myself down, combined with taking a breath, whatever my defects and imperfections, I accept myself unreservedly and completely. I know for me, the more I have come to believe that over the course of my life, the better my life has become. I alter it in my work with clients, or sometimes in saying it to myself. Sometimes I'll say, in spite of my many imperfections, I accept myself exactly as I am. And what that brings up for me is all the ways I don't accept myself, right? And that's fine. That's expanding my awareness. I get to look at those. Again, in spite of my many imperfections, I accept myself exactly as I am in this moment, with tons of imperfections and flaws and faults. Another one I like to use is, in spite of my many imperfections, I am a human being worthy of love. That's a tough one for most of us in my experience. In spite of my many imperfections, I'm a human being worthy of love. So the concept with those affirmative, self-affirming statements is, I can make all kinds of mistakes. I can do all kinds of terrible things in the course of my life. And, I can make amends for those things if I'm willing to. And that can be an important part of the healing process, both for myself and for others. But in spite of the terrible choices I've made and the harmful actions toward myself and others I have taken, as a human being, I am worthy of love. I am worthy of feeling worthwhile in my life and deserving of happiness. The more willing I am to look at those actions I've taken that have been harmful, that's terrific. That's what's going to help me move forward. But I need to begin as best I can from a position of I am a lovable, capable, worthwhile human being who learned a lot of coping strategies and a lot of unhelpful coping styles that have helped me at the time I found them or created them or learned them, but that no longer serve me in my life and that I need to let go of. In his chapter on living consciously, he wrote that living consciously means being willing to distinguish between facts, interpretations, and emotions. So this builds on what I read a few minutes ago about feelings are not necessarily trustworthy or reliable guides to reality. Being willing to distinguish between facts, interpretations, and emotions is a very important piece of learning to live more consciously. An example he gives is, I see you frowning at me. Okay, now take that one piece at a time. I see you frowning at me. I interpret this to mean you're angry with me. There's the interpretation. I feel hurt or defensive or wronged by you, or angry, or whatever it is I happen to feel. He points out, I may be correct or incorrect in my interpretation. And based on my interpretation, I may be appropriate or inappropriate in the feeling with which I respond. And here, by appropriate or inappropriate, he doesn't mean social appropriateness. He means is the way I'm feeling congruent with reality as well. That's what he means by appropriate or inappropriate. The point he's making is that my emotional responses to people and situations are determined by the meaning, the interpretation I give to those people and situations. And that in turn is a function of my psychology, my psychological makeup. If I'm a highly emotionally dependent person or have a highly emotionally dependent moment, I may indeed respond defensively or aggressively to a person who's frowning at me. If I'm more differentiated, as you've heard us talk about that, more autonomous, I may not take the person's behavior personally at all and just be curious about their frown and inquire as to its meaning or not inquire about it at all, as suits me at that moment. We introduce layer upon layer of confusion and pain and dysfunction into our relationships and our lives because we treat our interpretations of others as facts, as truth, without inquiring, without first seeking to understand. So that again is an example to me that encourages us to adopt an attitude of humility. Ask, are you upset with me if I see somebody frowning at me? Ask if I hear in their voice tone a bit of irritation or annoyance. Ask if they're upset with me. It might be something totally unrelated to me. That's bringing humility into my life, rather than somewhat arrogantly assuming and concluding that I know what's going on in the mind of this other person and their emotions. Another example of a practice with living consciously that fosters humility is noticing and confronting my impulses to avoid or deny threatening or painful realities. That's one of his things to look at specifically in living more consciously. Could not possibly be more aligned with looking at our character defects, right? In the 12 steps. I'll read that again. Noticing and confronting my impulses to avoid and deny painful or threatening realities, including realities of how I function, how I speak, how I behave. Still another example, being willing to see and correct mistakes. Pretty direct path toward acknowledging my own humility. right? As Bill recognizes over and over again in the 12 steps. One more, a concern to be aware of the values that move and guide me, as well as the roots, so that I'm not ruled by values I have irrationally adopted and formed perhaps as a very young child in the family that I was growing up in. And as Allen says, values that I have swallowed whole without chewing on, without, digesting, without reflecting on and saying, does this fit for me or does this not fit for me? Is this a value I want to live by or is it not? So there are lots of other examples I could give, from living with greater integrity to self-acceptance and self-responsibility, but I will leave it at that for tonight in terms of trying to draw parallels between Nathaniel Branden's writings on self-esteem and the 12 steps, and that there is indeed a great deal of humility in the 6 pillars, 7 if you include willingness, another point that can support the notion of humility, right, in Nathaniel Branden's work. So thank you all very much for your attention. And by the way, my headache is a lot better now. So thanks for letting me focus on this presentation as well. So I don't know if Allen is able to join us. Let's take a moment and see
Yeah,
if he's able to rejoin us. If not,
I'll throw him on a. I guess I can't spotlight him for some reason, but
yeah, he's if the rides are still open, he might have lost his connection and be.
he's here. We can hear his soothing voice. If he
Oh,
wants
okay, he is here with the
I see
audio
him.
at least.
Just,
Okay,
I can't spotlight him for some reason that I don't understand.
Alan, are you able to hear us, Alan?
He's written me a couple messages, so I know he's here, but I think his connection's really weak.
Okay.
His picture. Yeah, he says my internet's too weak. There you go.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So Herb,
Yes.
any thoughts? Whatever you would like to add to step 7, even including building on what you presented with us last week.
Yeah. Right. Well, lots of notes. Thank you, Roger, for a very thorough plumbing of the depth of this, connected with your understanding from Nathaniel Branden's work, as well as the discussions that we've had up to this point. It was wonderful. Just stepping back just a little bit in terms of where I come from, in terms of the steps, those first 3 steps are about my relationship with power. And that's such an important sort of beginning context, because what we're talking about is the 7th step, which is framed in the 2nd stage of the step process, which is steps 4 through 7. And that's a relationship with myself. This whole purpose of step 7 is the final rounding out and solution to the issues that have been surfaced in 4, 5, and 6. It's the healing step, as I call it. Not the big book doesn't necessarily use that term, but I do call it the healing, not only from my understanding of it, but also my experience with it. It was the if in fact step 4 was the soul surgery, the identification of the cancer in me. 5 was the beginning of the removal of the cancer. 6 is the identification of the implications and behavior that went with that cancer. And step 7 is the sewing up and the healing of and the rehabilitation of my relationship with myself. I've never used that before, but that works actually. Yeah, no, it really is a great picture. It's a great picture because it's actually my total experience with step 7. I'm not going there again, but the distinction that I was gifted in that process with the step 7 and step 6 was the distinction between inclination and behavior. very easy for me to identify the behavior once, in fact, I've been given the direction to do that and focus on that, because it's very objective. My inclinations are not so objective, it's pretty subjective. But I connected those to the instincts that we have in our structure. And in that sense, not only biologically, but in the spiritual sense of the 12 steps, we're powerless over our inclinations. And the inclinations are going to manifest in our behavior. And if in fact we haven't the consciousness, and I'm so glad that you stressed that part of it, because I think if there's any one word in all of our conversations about emotional sobriety, it's about consciousness. If you have the consciousness, everything else will be identified, the moving parts, and we'll be able to identify the integration or disintegration of the moving parts. But that consciousness, that's the critical piece of this journey of human development. This is really what we're talking about. And so the word and Bill's brilliance in chapter 7 with his articulation, unpacking of the word humility, from my background, I know that humility comes from the Latin humus, which means earth or dirt, not in a negative sense, but in the sense of common, not unique. I mean, here in the West LA, you go to the beach and you look at the sand, and there's grains of sand. And every one of the grains is quite unique, actually, and different. And yet, in a perspective of looking at the beach and the sand, they're completely anonymous. I mean, hundreds of millions of grains of sand, and they're anonymous. There's no uniqueness. There's no separateness. There's no distinction. And that's kind of the concept that Bill, not kind of, that is the concept that Bill is using in terms of the anonymity as a spiritual principle in the 12-step program. The anonymity meaning the deflation of the ego, that we're not God. I just finished doing a little thing previously on step 3, and the key words in the step 3 in the big book is we need to quit playing God, because that's the undeveloped, unconscious human being, the center not only of their world, but the center of the world, unconscious of that, hardened narcissism, if you will, and operating that way so that people and places in the world around them are just collateral damage so that they can have, in fact, what they want. Perhaps too much self-disclosure there.
and adding a touch of humility, which I appreciate.
We're all narcissists, so don't worry about it.
Yeah, exactly.
And so the total point of step 7 is to acknowledge that balance between my humanity, the behavior, and the inclinations, the humanity, over which I have very little conscious management. They're inclinations in me, but the responsibility to, in fact, begin to exercise some management in the assumption, the underlying assumptions of the 12-step program. Of course, there's a higher power, whatever that means to somebody, that I can, in fact, rely on to support me as I attempt to self-regulate in my behavior. And so the insight that I had, which I shared last week, was that I'm powerless over the inclination. In the truest of senses, I want to be a better person. I just can't seem to effect it. But I am 100% responsible eventually for the behavior that goes with it. But the only way that I can be really accountable is to some objective person who's going to be a mirror and reflect back to me the truth. And I'm so glad that you connected those two terms, humility and truth. St. Teresa of Avila, one of the mystics of the 16th century, said, humility is truth. And when you talk about what we're unpacking here for weeks and months about reality and emotional sobriety, reality just is.
Yeah.
It's just that simple. No. Reality just is what it is. It's not right or wrong. It's not bad or good. It just is. And it just keeps flowing like the river. And if we want to have a sense of happiness and success and fitting in, figure out what the flow is and get in the flow. And I don't mean to be rolling over in passive, the last thing I mean about that, but with all the willpower I have, figure out what the flow of reality is in terms of how it's manifesting, and then get into the flow of that manifestation, that evolution of reality as it is, and quit fighting it. And you use the term acceptance. I mean, accept reality as it is, adjust my attitude to that I'm a human being and I will make mistakes, but they don't name me. And then take the actions that align and or realign me. And the word I use is course correction.
Yeah.
I'm in a daily consciousness of course correction, because I'm always bumping up against reality.
And my imperfections and defects.
No, I bump up against your imperfections.
Not yours. I love that. Thanks for pointing out about earth, hummus, humility. A phrase I like to use a lot is, we use the expression down to earth, right, about certain people, and that it's so fitting to me for a description of a humble. That you brought to mind a couple of other quotes. You in your book, 12 Steps to Spiritual Awakening, you also quoted Thomas Merton when you're writing about chapter 7. In humility, we find perfect freedom because in humility, we accept the truth. Yeah. And I thought that was such a great meaning. Yeah. As we become more humble, which is not easy for me, at least, as our pride and egocentrism slowly give way, what distorts our perception of reality slowly gives way, right? We become more able to see that what is, as you just said. Nathaniel uses exactly those words in his book, that, recognition of truth is realizing that what is, exactly as you said. A couple of other short quotes, one by the famous author and theologian as well, in a way, C.S. Lewis. I love this one. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less.
I've heard it before. I didn't know he was the author, though.
Humility is not thinking less of yourself in the sense of self-worth or self-esteem. It is thinking of yourself less, thinking of yourself in a much more contextual. Yeah. Doesn't mean not thinking of yourself at all either, but it means thinking of yourself in connection with others. Brian, any thoughts? Allen suggested that I turn to you since he's not available. Any thoughts on this whole subject of step 7? Go ahead.
I've just been soaking in everything you guys have been saying. If I was I'm gonna try to be quick, just because I want to see if we can leave room for some people to share, but still throw some things in. When I was listening to step 7, framing it with the information that you guys both threw out and just what I've learned through this meeting and other stuff, how I would say it in my own words is humbly ask to have a more nourishing relationship with my character defects or with myself. And Herb, I don't know if I've heard you say that before, but for some reason it struck me tonight. 4 through 7 is about our relationship to ourselves, and that just capped it off for me. It was perfect. And see, so that I wrote that down before that, and I was like, wow, that's perfect.
Yeah.
Then the more nourishing relationship with our character defects, I think, really is about acceptance, right? And humility. But the acceptance, I think what's cool about it is it leads us to a place of being more connected to reality. So does humility, whereas arrogance or negative arrogance separate us from reality and they make it harder to deal with what's going on. And then Allen said something that he said some things I wanted to throw in too. Step 6 is insight into our adaptations and their functions. Step 7 is integrating our insight into corrective emotional experiences. with insight comes responsibility. So
Yeah.
it isn't just about acceptance. The acceptance of yourself, all your character defects, and all of the different parts of you is what allows you to take more responsibility for yourself and how you show up in the world. So it's not just about, oh, I'm just the way I am, I can't help it.
No,
It's the opposite. It's more responsibility.
right. It's
Um,
not cutting ourselves any slack or rationalizing it or condoning it. It's kind of like, oh, look at that. That's
Yeah.
embarrassing.
Yeah. So it's my condensed version of what I wanted to chip in, and but thanks for asking, and I got a lot out of tonight. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
I hear a lot of people criticize the 12 steps that they're old-fashioned. I can understand that criticism. They were written back in 1935. Some people that are agnostic have difficulty with the word God used in the steps. For me, I look at the process that's involved, the forces that the 12 steps generate are so powerful that I think they're ageless. There's this interesting phenomena that happens when you work the steps. They create a charge and then a discharge. You know, the first step, we're powerless. Our life has become unmanageable. It creates this charge. You know, we're in big trouble and we don't know what to do. And then step 2 comes along and it says we have hope. That charge, that existential crisis that we have is resolved. What's happening here is parallel to life. We charge ourselves when we breathe in. When we exhale, we discharge. That's the rhythm of life. And the way I love to think about the 12 steps, it's helping us get connected to the rhythm of life so we can learn how to show up in a good way.